A veteran enters a diner after a long day, just looking for a hot meal and a moment of peace. But instead, he's met with hostility from a smug waitress who mutters, "People like you don't belong here." What she doesn't realize is that someone extraordinary is watching it all unfold, none other than Snoop Dogg himself. And what happens next will leave the entire diner speechless. The diner buzzed with its usual mix of clattering dishes, cheerful chatter, and the occasional bark of an order from the kitchen. Nestled in a quiet, suburban town, it was a favorite among locals, known for its home-style food and unspoken rules. But beneath the warm facade lay the unspoken undertones of judgment and subtle bias. For some, the diner felt like home. For others, it was a reminder they didn't quite belong. Behind the counter stood Karen, the manager, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk. She wore her diner uniform, a crisp white shirt tucked into a navy blue skirt, as though it were a badge of honor. Her movements were brisk and calculated, each step a declaration of authority. Karen had the kind of face that rarely smiled, her thin lips set in a perpetual frown. Her pristine apron hung over her frame, spotless as always, because in Karen's world, appearances mattered. The bell above the door jingled softly, announcing a new customer. James stepped in, his broad shoulders framed against the fading sunlight. Tall and dignified, his presence commanded attention without trying. His pressed shirt and polished shoes spoke of discipline, but the weariness in his eyes hinted at a day that had demanded too much. He carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had faced battles, both on the field and in life, and come out standing. Karen's gaze locked on him the moment he entered, her expression hardening like steel. She sighed audibly, not bothering to hide her irritation. Under her breath, just loud enough for the servers nearby to hear, she muttered, "Here we go again." The words hung in the air, laced with a subtle venom that went unnoticed by most. But James caught it. He paused briefly, then walked toward an empty booth, the faint tension in the air now undeniable. James settled onto the red vinyl stool at the counter, his movements deliberate and calm. The well-worn menu rested in his hands, its laminated surface reflecting the soft glow of the diner's neon lights. He scanned it thoughtfully, his fingers tracing the options. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, burgers, everything seemed like a warm invitation on a plate. He looked up, ready to ask a question. Karen approached, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Her smile was tight, more a mechanical movement of muscles than a genuine expression. She didn't bother with a friendly welcome, or even a polite, "What can I get you?" Instead, she stared at him, her posture rigid, and said flatly, "Ready to order?" James nodded politely. "What's in the house special? I'm looking for something hearty." Karen raised an eyebrow as though the question were absurd. "It's chicken," she said curtly, her tone void of warmth. She didn't elaborate. James, unfazed, glanced back at the menu. "All right, and does it come with sides?" Karen sighed, loud enough to turn a few heads nearby. "It's written right there," she snapped, tapping the menu with a manicured nail. "Sides are extra." She immediately turned her back and busied herself pouring coffee for another patron, leaving James mid-sentence. Instead of growing annoyed, James sat quietly, his posture steady. His calm demeanor seemed to fuel Karen's irritation. Returning to the counter, she didn't meet his gaze, choosing instead to over-explain his next request. "So, just black coffee," James clarified when she finally returned. Karen smirked slightly, grabbing a cup. "Black coffee," she repeated slowly, as though explaining a complex idea. "You know that means no cream, right?" James simply nodded, not rising to the bait. She set the coffee down without a word and immediately moved to serve the couple seated 2 stools down, exchanging jokes and pleasantries with them in stark contrast to her clipped exchanges with James. Throughout it all, Karen avoided eye contact. Her body language screamed disinterest, her curt responses designed to belittle. But James didn't flinch. His silence, his calm, it wasn't submission. It was dignity. Karen, however, mistook his restraint for weakness, her irritation growing with every unreactive moment. She couldn't stand that he didn't fight back. James glanced at the clock above the counter. 20 minutes had passed since he'd placed his order. The diner, while lively, was clearly not overwhelmed. Yet customers who had walked in long after him were already eating. He adjusted his posture, his back straightened as if summoning all his patience. Then, he raised a hand politely, signaling Karen. She approached with a forced smile, her lips tight, her eyes already rolling before she stopped at his table. "What now?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. "Ma'am," James began, keeping his tone even. "I've been waiting quite some time. Could you check on my order, please?" Karen scoffed, her hands on her hips. "Well, aren't we demanding?" she snapped. "Maybe if you were patient like everyone else, you wouldn't have to make a fuss." A hush seemed to fall around the counter. The clinking of forks and muffled chatter dimmed as several diners glanced in their direction. Some whispered, while others buried themselves in their meals, pretending not to notice. James exhaled slowly, the soldier in him instinctively maintaining composure. "With respect, ma'am, I've been waiting longer than others," he replied. His voice remained steady, but his words carried a weight that hinted at years of discipline. Karen's expression hardened, and her voice sharpened. "Oh, I see. Playing the victim, huh? You people are always so quick to assume someone's out to get you." She laughed mockingly, loud enough for the nearest patrons to hear. The air grew heavier. A young couple at a nearby table exchanged uneasy glances. An older man at the end of the counter shifted in his seat, muttering something under his breath, but no one spoke up. James's jaw tightened, but his gaze never wavered. He looked at Karen calmly, refusing to be baited by her words. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm just asking for the same courtesy you're showing everyone else." Karen smirked, shaking her head as if he were a child who just didn't understand the rules. "Courtesy?" she sneered. "Maybe if you acted like you deserved it, you'd get some." Behind her, the bell on the diner door jingled. A few heads turned as a tall figure entered, moving with an unmistakable air of confidence. Snoop Dogg, dressed in a sleek black hoodie and sunglasses, paused just inside the doorway, his sharp gaze scanning the room. He spotted the tension at the counter almost immediately. Karen's condescending tone carried across the diner, and the stiff body language of James told him everything he needed to know. Quietly, Snoop moved to a seat near the door, leaning back as he observed the scene unfold. Karen, oblivious to the new arrival, leaned closer to James, her words dripping with disdain. "Look, I don't have time for this. If you don't like the service, you're welcome to leave." James opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a deep, smooth voice cut through the room. "Excuse me, but I think he's got every right to be here." All eyes turned towards Snoop, whose casual tone belied the intensity in his gaze. The room's energy shifted in an instant, the tension crackling like static as Karen straightened, startled. And just like that, the quiet veteran was no longer alone. The soft jingle of the diner's door barely registered with Karen, who remained fixed on James with her cutting glare. But for a few patrons, the arrival of Snoop Dogg was impossible to ignore. Whispers rippled across the room as those who recognized him tried not to stare. He moved with a confident ease, his signature swagger unmistakable. Snoop scanned the scene, his sharp eyes taking in every detail: the clenched jaw of James, the mocking smirk on Karen's face, the tense stillness of the surrounding diners. He didn't rush in. Instead, he slid into a booth near the door, leaning back as if he had all the time in the world. At the counter, Karen crossed her arms, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're not special," she spat, her words laced with venom. "People like you think you deserve everything handed to you." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. James stiffened, his hands resting on the counter, but he said nothing. His calm demeanor was a testament to his discipline, but the hurt in his eyes was undeniable. Snoop's head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. He stood, smooth and unhurried, and began walking toward the counter. His steps were deliberate, the soles of his sneakers tapping lightly against the diner's tiled floor. Karen continued, oblivious to the shift in the room's energy. "If you don't like it here, maybe you should just go somewhere else," she sneered. "Excuse me?" Snoop's voice cut through her tirade like a knife. It was low, steady, and carried an authority that made everyone stop and turn. Karen's head snapped toward him, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion, then to a flicker of recognition. "What exactly do you mean by people like him?" Snoop asked, his tone deceptively calm. Karen blinked, stumbling over her words. I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered, her confidence faltering. "I was just saying—" Snoop raised a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. "Nah, don't try to backtrack now," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "You said what you said. Own it." The diners watched in stunned silence, their gazes darting between Karen and Snoop. James turned slightly, his surprise evident. For the first time, he felt the weight of someone standing firmly in his corner. Karen's face flushed, and she straightened her apron nervously. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," she muttered, her eyes darting around the room. "It's just, some people expect special treatment." "Special treatment?" Snoop repeated, raising an eyebrow. "This man's been sitting here, minding his business, waiting longer than anyone else, and you're out here treating him like he's asking for the moon." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Snoop stepped closer, his presence commanding. "Let me tell you something," he said, his tone still calm but carrying an edge. "That man right there? He's got more patience and dignity in his little finger than you're showing right now." James finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I just wanted the same service as everyone else." Snoop turned to him and nodded. "And that's the least you deserve, my brother." The tension in the diner was thick, but something had shifted. A few patrons murmured their agreement, while others nodded silently. Karen fidgeted, her bravado crumbling under the weight of the moment. Snoop leaned slightly closer to her, his gaze unwavering. "Respect isn't optional. It's not something you decide to hand out to who you think is worthy. It's a basic thing, and trust me, people like you," he gestured toward her apron, "need to learn that quick." Karen swallowed hard, retreating a step. I'll go check on his order," she mumbled, disappearing into the kitchen. Snoop turned back to James, offering a small nod. "You good?" James, still processing what had just happened, managed a faint smile. "I think so. Thanks." Snoop smiled, clapping a hand on James's shoulder. "No need to thank me, man. You handled yourself like a champ." The room buzzed with whispers as Snoop returned to his seat, his calm presence leaving a lasting impression. Karen, now out of sight, had been put firmly in her place. Karen emerged from the kitchen, her face flushed but her posture defiant. She carried a tray with a single plate, slamming it onto the counter in front of James. "Here," she said curtly. "Happy now?" James looked at the plate, then at Karen. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered. "I just wanted fair treatment," he said, his voice measured. Karen scoffed, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Fair treatment? You've been nothing but confrontational since you walked in here, acting like you're some kind of victim." The diner fell silent again. A few diners exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke up. Snoop Dogg leaned forward in his seat, resting his elbows on the counter. "Confrontational?" he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "This man's been sitting here, polite and patient, while you've been disrespecting him at every turn. And now you're calling him the problem?" Karen's head snapped toward Snoop. "I don't see how this concerns you," she shot back, her tone defensive. Snoop stood slowly, his tall frame towering over her. "It concerns me when I see a good man getting treated like dirt for no reason," he said, his voice calm but firm. Karen folded her arms, her bravado faltering slightly. "I'm just doing my job," she muttered. "No," Snoop said, his voice sharp. "Doing your job means treating people with respect. Doesn't matter what they look like or where they come from." The tension in the diner was palpable, and then, from the corner, a voice broke the silence. "She's done this before," a woman said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger. All eyes turned to the speaker, an older woman seated near the window. "She's always rude to certain people. I've seen it." A man at a nearby table nodded in agreement. "Last week she made a scene with a delivery driver. Same attitude, same words. It's a pattern." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. "That's not true," she snapped. "You're all just trying to make me look bad." Snoop chuckled, shaking his head. "Karen, you're doing a fine job of that all by yourself." The diners chuckled nervously, their tension easing slightly. James, who had been quietly observing, cleared his throat. "Let me tell you something," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. The room grew quiet again as he stood, his tall frame commanding attention. "I served this country for over 20 years. I've seen things that would break most people. I didn't ask for recognition or special treatment. All I ever wanted was to come home to a country that treats everyone with respect. Is that too much to ask?" His words hung in the air, heavy with truth and emotion. A few diners nodded, their gazes fixed on him with newfound respect. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her confidence crumbling under the weight of James's calm but powerful statement. Snoop stepped closer to James, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "This man deserves more than respect," he said, his voice rising slightly. "He deserves gratitude. Sacrificing for a country that sometimes doesn't even see him for who he is. That takes strength, and y'all need to recognize that." The patrons murmured in agreement, their whispers turning into supportive comments. Karen, flustered and unable to defend herself, stammered, "I didn't know he was a veteran." Snoop tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "You shouldn't need to know. Respect should be the default, Karen, not something you decide who's earned it." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, with a few people openly criticizing Karen's behavior. "She's got no business working here," one man said. "We don't need people like her in this town," added another. Karen threw up her hands. "Fine. You all want to gang up on me? I'll go," she snapped, retreating to the kitchen in a flurry of frustration and embarrassment. As the kitchen door swung shut behind her, the diner buzzed with energy. People turned to James, some offering apologies, others thanking him for his service. Snoop raised his hand, silencing the room. "This isn't just about one bad apple," he said. "It's about all of us standing up when we see wrong and speaking out when someone's treated unfairly. That's how we make things better. Together." James nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. For the first time that evening, he felt truly seen. The tension in the diner dissipated, replaced with a sense of solidarity. Karen might have retreated, but the message was clear. Respect and dignity would always win the day. The fallout began almost immediately. Patrons who had recorded the confrontation with their phones didn't waste a moment uploading the clips to social media. Within minutes, the hashtags #VeteranJustice and #KarenExposed began trending. The videos captured everything: Karen's dismissive behavior, James's calm dignity, and Snoop's powerful intervention. The online world erupted. "This is exactly what we mean when we talk about everyday racism," one user commented. Another wrote, "Snoop Dogg standing up for a veteran. This is the kind of leadership we need." The posts racked up millions of views, retweets, and shares. In one clip, Snoop's commanding voice could be heard asking, "What exactly do you mean by people like him?" The internet applauded his sharp rhetoric and unwavering stance. "Snoop handled that with the grace of a king," read another comment, like thousands of times. As the videos spread, local news stations picked up the story. Anchors played the clips repeatedly, introducing James as a respected military veteran wronged by blatant prejudice. Interviews with witnesses revealed Karen's history of similar behavior, further fueling public outrage. One witness stated, "She's always had an attitude, but this crossed the line. James didn't deserve that, especially after all he's done for this country." Karen, however, was unprepared for the storm heading her way. Within hours, the diner's phone rang incessantly, with calls ranging from angry complaints to outright threats. The once busy establishment saw its crowd dwindle to a trickle as word of Karen's actions spread. Boycotts began to form. Locals organized protests outside the diner, holding signs that read, "Respect our veterans" and "No place for hate here." The diner's management, overwhelmed by the backlash, issued a statement distancing themselves from Karen. Karen, on the other hand, attempted damage control. She claimed her actions were misunderstood, painting herself as the victim of an overblown social media frenzy, but her efforts only fueled the fire. "Misunderstood," one tweet retorted. "We heard you loud and clear." Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg took to his own social media platform. In a heartfelt video, he addressed the incident directly. "Look," he began, leaning toward the camera, his tone calm but serious. "What happened today ain't right. Respect is the bare minimum we owe each other, especially to folks like James who've served and sacrificed for all of us. We gotta do better, y'all. No excuses." The video struck a chord, amassing millions of views within hours. "Snoop always speaks facts," one user commented. Others praised him for using his platform to shed light on such an important issue. But Snoop didn't stop there. He used the moment to amplify the broader conversation about respect, equality, and the treatment of veterans. He highlighted organizations that support veterans and called on his followers to donate or volunteer. James, meanwhile, found himself at the center of the storm. Local reporters reached out for interviews, and his quiet life was momentarily upended by the influx of attention. Despite the chaos, he remained composed. When asked about the incident, he said simply, "I didn't expect it to go this far. I'm just grateful for those who stood up for what's right." The outpouring of support overwhelmed James. Neighbors stopped by his house to thank him for his service and apologize for Karen's behavior. Some even left gifts and notes on his doorstep, expressing their gratitude and admiration. Karen, on the other hand, became the symbol of everything wrong with unchecked prejudice. Memes of her flustered face during the confrontation circulated widely, and public opinion turned decisively against her. Even those who might have sympathized with her in other circumstances found her actions indefensible in light of the evidence. As the viral videos continued to spread, the incident became more than just a local scandal. It ignited a nationwide conversation about the everyday biases people face and the importance of speaking out against injustice. For James and Snoop, the incident was a reminder of the power of solidarity. The backlash against Karen hit like a tidal wave. By morning, the diner's management was inundated with calls, emails, and social media messages. Some were from loyal customers expressing their disappointment. Others were from furious strangers demanding accountability. The local diner, once a beloved staple in the town, was now under siege. Behind the scenes, the management scrambled to address the escalating crisis. The owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Peters, called an emergency meeting with the staff. Karen walked into the meeting room, her head held high as if she were above the chaos. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice dripping with indignation. "I didn't do anything wrong. People are blowing this out of proportion." The room fell silent as Mr. Peters played one of the viral videos for everyone to see. Karen's sharp words and dismissive tone filled the room. The tension was palpable. Her colleagues, who had grown accustomed to her condescending behavior, exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded subtly as if to say, "Finally, someone's calling her out." When the video ended, Mr. Peters folded his hands on the table, his expression grim. "Karen," he said, his voice measured, "we have a problem. This behavior does not align with our values or policies. The public is demanding accountability, and frankly, they're right." Karen bristled. "So, you're just going to throw me under the bus?" she snapped. "I've worked here for years. I've seen worse behavior go unchecked, but when it's me, suddenly there's a problem?" Her defiance only hardened the owner's resolve. "This isn't about what others may or may not have done. It's about what you did," Mr. Peters replied. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, and you crossed the line." Karen's colleagues remained silent. Some appeared uncomfortable, while others seemed relieved. Her usual bravado faltered as she realized no one was coming to her defense. "You can't fire me over this!" she exclaimed, her voice rising. "This is cancel culture at its worst!" Mr. Peters stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "This isn't about cancel culture. This is about accountability. I'm sorry, Karen, but your employment here is terminated, effective immediately." Karen's dismissal became yet another viral moment. A patron who overheard the conversation recorded Karen's outburst as she stormed out of the diner. The clip spread quickly, with captions like, "Justice served," and "Actions have consequences." Meanwhile, James sat quietly at home, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. The memories of Karen's cutting remarks still stung, but knowing she had been held accountable brought him a sense of peace. He thought about Snoop's intervention and the support he had received from strangers. For once, he felt seen, not just as a veteran, but as a person who deserved respect. As the news about Karen's firing continued to spread, messages of support poured in for James. Neighbors dropped by with kind words, and even strangers sent letters thanking him for his composure and resilience. Karen, however, faced a much harsher reality. Her social media accounts were bombarded with criticism, and her reputation in the town was shattered. In her defiance, she had underestimated the power of accountability. Justice had been served, and for James, that was enough. Snoop Dogg leaned casually against his sleek black SUV, watching James with a thoughtful expression. He had just delivered one of his most impactful speeches, but now, in the quiet aftermath, he wanted to check in with the man who had endured so much. "Yo, big man!" Snoop called out, his smooth voice carrying warmth. "You good?" James turned toward him, surprised that the celebrity was still there. "I don't even know where to start," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "What you did back there, I'll never forget it." Snoop walked over, his presence as commanding as ever but softened by a genuine concern. "Man, you handled yourself like a king in there," Snoop replied. "You didn't lose your cool, even when she was throwing all that mess your way. That takes strength." James shook his head, his gaze dropping to the ground. "It's not the first time," he admitted. "People look at me and see what they want to see, never who I really am. It gets exhausting, you know." Snoop nodded, his face reflecting understanding. "I hear you, brother. Too many people out here judging books by their covers, but tonight you showed them who you are, a man who deserves respect." James chuckled softly, the weight of Snoop's words sinking in. "Respect," he repeated. "Funny how it's something I fought for, bled for, and still have to demand in my own country." Snoop's brow furrowed. "You a veteran?" James nodded, his pride shining through despite his weariness. "Served 15 years, Army, tours in Afghanistan and Iraq." "Man," Snoop said, his tone shifting to reverence. "That's heavy. You gave so much and they still treat you like this?" He gestured toward the diner, his frustration bubbling to the surface. James shrugged. It's not just me. There are so many of us who've given everything, and when we come back, it feels like we're invisible, like we don't matter anymore. Snoop placed a hand on James's shoulder, his voice steady and sincere. Nah, you matter. Every single one of y'all matters. And tonight, the world saw that. James blinked, his throat tightening. You think anyone will really care? Snoop smiled, his signature charisma shining through. Oh, they'll care. Trust me, man, when the dog steps in, people listen. But it ain't just about me. It's about you sharing your story, letting people see the man behind the uniform. You got a light, James. Don't let anyone dim it. James stood taller, the words stirring something inside him. I've never thought about it like that, he admitted. Well, start thinking, Snoop said with a grin. The world needs to hear from folks like you. Strong, steady, and unshakable. You ain't invisible, my man. You're unstoppable. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the shared understanding between them needing no words. Finally, James extended his hand. Thank you, he said simply, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. Snoop shook his hand firmly, meeting his gaze. No, thank you. For your service, for your courage, tonight and every other day. Don't let this be the end of your story. Let it be the beginning. As James turned to leave, he glanced back at Snoop, a faint smile on his face. You're something else, Snoop. Keep doing what you're doing. Snoop chuckled, sliding back into his SUV. Same to you, soldier. Same to you. As the taillights of the black SUV disappeared into the night, James felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. In that brief moment, two very different lives had intersected, leaving both men changed for the better. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, clips of the confrontation at the diner flooded social media platforms, drawing millions of views. Karen's dismissive tone, James's unshakable calm, and Snoop Dogg's powerful intervention became the talk of the nation. The hashtags number respect veterans and number stand with James trended worldwide, igniting a fiery conversation about racism, prejudice, and the treatment of those who had served the country. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Local stations featured interviews with patrons who had witnessed the scene, many of whom expressed shame for not stepping in sooner. National broadcasters dove deeper, uncovering James's distinguished military record. Pictures of him in uniform, medals glinting on his chest, flashed across screens as anchors praised his grace under pressure. James Turner, one headline declared, from invisible to invincible. James, who had always shied away from the spotlight, found himself thrust into the center of a movement. At first, he was overwhelmed. His phone rang non-stop with calls from reporters and messages of support. Neighbors who had never spoken to him before stopped by to shake his hand, their voices filled with apologies and admiration. For James, it was a bittersweet validation. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg used his immense platform to amplify the story. He posted the full video on his social media, adding a heartfelt caption. This right here, this is why we have to stand up. James fought for this country, and he deserves every ounce of respect. Let's show him some love. The post garnered millions of likes, shares, and comments, sparking a surge of action across the country. Fundraisers began almost immediately. A community member started a GoFundMe to honor James's service and resilience. The initial goal was modest, but within days, donations poured in, far surpassing expectations. Let's give James the recognition he deserves, one donor wrote. The funds not only helped James repair his aging truck, but also provided resources for him to explore new opportunities, including speaking engagements and mentorship programs for young veterans. The impact didn't stop there. Schools and organizations began using the incident as a case study in how to address prejudice with courage and unity. Workshops and discussions were organized, with James often invited as a speaker. His calm, measured recounting of the events moved audiences, driving home the importance of empathy and respect. For Snoop, the event became a catalyst for broader initiatives. He announced a partnership with veteran support organizations, pledging to raise awareness and funds for those who had served. His advocacy extended beyond social media, with appearances on talk shows and podcasts where he shared the story and urged others to reflect on their own biases. "It's not about just one diner," Snoop said in an interview. "It's about what happens everywhere, every day. We've got to do better, for our veterans, for our people, for everyone." The community rallied around James in unexpected ways. Local businesses offered discounts and free meals to veterans as a gesture of appreciation. A small-town bookstore organized a signing for James when it was revealed he'd been working on a memoir of his military experiences. The event was packed, with attendees eager to hear his story and express their gratitude. Karen, however, faced the opposite response. The backlash against her was swift and unrelenting. The diner's management announced her termination in a public statement, reinforcing their commitment to inclusivity. "We deeply regret this incident and are taking steps to ensure it never happens again," the statement read. Despite the controversy, the incident achieved something profound. It united people across divides. Strangers reached out to James, sharing their own experiences of prejudice and thanking him for his bravery. Veterans organizations saw a spike in engagement, with people inspired by James's story volunteering their time and resources. As the weeks passed, James began to see the ripple effects firsthand. During a speaking event at a local high school, a young student approached him, eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Turner," the boy said, clutching a notebook, "you're my hero." James smiled, his voice steady as he replied, "The real heroes are the ones who stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. You can be one of them." The incident at the diner became more than just a viral moment. It was a wake-up call, a reminder of the power of unity and the strength it takes to stand against injustice. For James, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where his voice, once overlooked, became a beacon of hope and change. James stood before a packed auditorium, his voice steady yet heartfelt. Students leaned forward, captivated by his story of resilience and dignity. "It's not about how others see you," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "It's about how you see yourself and the courage to stand firm, even when it's tough." Applause erupted, and James felt a newfound sense of purpose. What began as a painful encounter at a diner had become the foundation of a new chapter in his life. Invitations flooded in from schools, community centers, and veteran organizations. James shared his experiences not only as a veteran, but as a man who had faced prejudice head-on. Each speech inspired change, sparking conversations about empathy, unity, and respect. His words resonated, especially with young audiences who saw in him the embodiment of perseverance. The diner, meanwhile, underwent a transformation. The owner, determined to rebuild its reputation, introduced mandatory training programs for all staff. Workshops on diversity, inclusion, and customer respect became a cornerstone of the diner's policies. The walls that once echoed with Karen's dismissive tone now hummed with a renewed commitment to kindness. Regular patrons noticed the difference, a warmer atmosphere, a stronger sense of community. Snoop Dogg, never one to shy away from a teachable moment, shared his reflections on the incident with his massive online audience. "Sometimes," he said in a candid video, "all it takes is one moment to stand up, to say, 'This ain't right,' and that one moment can change lives." His words sparked thousands of comments, with followers vowing to act with courage and kindness in their own lives. James's life flourished in ways he hadn't imagined. The fundraiser started by strangers helped him repair his truck and support local veterans. He found joy in helping others, from mentoring young veterans to supporting community initiatives. The community, once silent in the face of injustice, emerged stronger and more united. Neighbors who had avoided tough conversations now rallied together, inspired by James's bravery and Snoop's advocacy. The incident became a turning point, a shared story of redemption and growth. As James closed one of his speeches, a student raised a hand, asking what kept him going through it all. James smiled. "Hope," he said simply. "Hope for a better tomorrow, and knowing we can all be part of making it happen." The journey had been challenging, but it left a legacy of courage, compassion, and unity that would endure.